In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Euthyphro dilemma, which takes its name from a dialogue called Euthyphro, written by Plato, in which a character named Euthyphro gives voice to the view that morality depends upon the gods. Before we get into the dialogue, I want to take a look at some questions that closely parallel the issue at the heart of the dilemma. The first question concerns this little boy whose name is Timmy. Timmy's just thrown his ball across the street, and he's about to walk out there to retrieve his ball. But as he does, he remembers that his parents have told him that when crossing the street, he needs to look both ways. So the question I want us to consider is the following. Do Timmy's parents say that it's safe to look both ways before crossing the street because it is safe? Or is it safe to look both ways because his parents say that it's safe? So think about this question and decide whether you're going to take option A, that his parents say it's safe because it is safe, or option B, that it's safe because his parents say it is. So if you've thought about this, you probably recognize that there is something very odd about option B. It suggests that what makes something safe is that Timmy's parents say that it's safe. But that can't be correct. If Timmy's parents said that playing with knives is safe, that would not make it safe. Playing with knives is not safe no matter what his parents say. Option A is surely the correct option. It says that Timmy's parents recognize that looking both ways is safe, which means that it is safe independently of what they say, and then they tell Timmy to do so because it's safe. The next question is about a movie review. So there's a new film coming out called Ninja's Attack, starring Robert Downey Jr., Ken Jeong, Kate Winslet, and Brad Pitt. And Roger Ebert has reviewed the film, given it a thumbs up, and said it's a great film. So the question for us here is, does Ebert say that the film is great because it is a great film? Or is the film great because Ebert says that it is? So once again, I want you to think about these two options. The first option is that Ebert says it's a great film because Ninja's Attack is great. Option B is that Ninja's Attack is a great film just because Ebert says that it is. So once again, you probably recognize that there is something pretty odd about option B. It implies that what makes a film great is just that Roger Ebert says that it's a great film. But if Ebert said that Howard the Duck was a great film, this would not make that movie great. Howard the Duck is a bad movie no matter what Ebert says about it. Now in this example, personal preference plays a role that it did not play in the previous example. People can and do disagree about whether a film is good and about what makes a film good. But no matter what your view is concerning what makes a film great, whether it be fine acting, exceptional cinematography, captivating plot, good dialogue, or what have you, you probably agree that a film's greatness is independent of anything Roger Ebert says about it. As a reviewer, Ebert's job is to evaluate films, and so if he says a film is great, it should be because he recognizes that it has features that make for a great film, and that it has these features independently of him. So option A is obviously the better option. It says that Ebert recognizes that the film is great, and he says that it's great because of that recognition. So the next question concerns morality in its relation to God. Let's consider the following list of actions: telling the truth, helping others, being unselfish, being respectful towards others, being faithful, and avoiding harm. And let's assume, for the sake of this question, that these are all the right thing to do, at least in most circumstances. And let's also assume that God says that these are the right thing to do, again, at least in most circumstances. So the question here is, for any of the actions on this list, does God say that it is right because it is right? Or is the action right because God says that it is? So once again, decide which of these options you're going to take. Option A says that God says that the action is right because it is right, and option B says that the action is right because God says that it is. In this case, it is perhaps not so obvious to you which of these is the correct option. But let's notice that option B has the same kind of implications that the parallel options had in the previous two examples. That is, option B implies that what makes an action right is just that God says that it's right, and one imperative consequence of this is that God can make any action right just by saying that it's right. But is that correct? Could God, for example, make killing your neighbor right just by saying that it is? Well, we'll return to this question later, but let's also look at the consequences of option A. It implies that morality is independent of God, just as a film's greatness is independent of Ebert, and something's being safe is independent of Timmy's parents. So let's turn now to the Euthyphro dialogue and to the dilemma that takes its name from the dialogue. The participants in the dialogue are Socrates and a man named Euthyphro, and they are talking about the pious. Now, I don't want to get too hung up on the meaning of the word pious, so we're going to think of pious as meaning the same as right or righteous. So for the sake of this discussion, a pious action is just a morally right action. Now, Euthyphro tells Socrates that he knows what the pious is. That is, he knows what features all pious actions have in common, in virtue of which they are pious. In other words, he knows what makes an action pious. And his answer is that the pious is what is loved by all of the gods. When he says this, Socrates asks him a very important question. He asks, do the gods love the pious because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? Since Socrates and Euthyphro lived in a polytheistic culture, whereas we want to look at the implications of the dilemma on modern theistic belief systems, we'll rephrase Socrates' question slightly to put it in monotheistic terms, and we'll also change the word pious to right. So put another way, Socrates' question becomes, does God love right acts because they are right, or are they right because God loves them? And we could also put the question in terms of what God says or commands rather than what he loves. So this question presents the Euthyphro dilemma. It's called a dilemma because there are only two options, and each of the options is unattractive for its own reasons. So there are two horns of the dilemma, and no matter which option Euthyphro chooses, he will be impaled by one horn or the other. So let's take a close look at the options so as to understand what is problematic about each one. So the first option is that God says that right actions are right because they are right. And the second option says that an action is right just because God says that it is. So these are the two horns of the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, it's important to point out that this is a dilemma only for anyone who believes that God is the source of morality. Each of the options will be unattractive to such a person, though not necessarily someone who isn't committed to that belief. So what is the problem with option A? It implies that morality is independent of God. That is, that God doesn't determine what is right and wrong. Well, why is that? Well, option A says that God says that an action is right just because it is right. If an action's rightness is the basis for God saying that it is right, then the action must be right prior to and independent of what God says. So the idea is that God exists and there is an independent standard of rightness and wrongness that is separate and independent of God. God recognizes whether an action matches the standard. In other words, he recognizes whether an act is right or not, and then he tells us on the basis of that recognition whether the action is right. The logic here is precisely the same as in our earlier example involving Timmy. Option A here required that something's being safe is independent of whatever Timmy's parents say. And in the same way, the claim that God says that an action is right because it is right requires that an act's being right is independent of God. So if we take option A, we are forced to accept that God doesn't determine what's right or wrong because rightness and wrongness is independent of God. What happens if we take the other horn of the dilemma? Well, this option has the unfortunate consequence that morality is arbitrary. Why is that? Well, let's perform a little thought experiment. Let's go back to the beginning of time when God was creating the universe and deciding which actions are right and which are wrong. Option B says that God gets to decide this, that he can make an action right just by saying that it is right. Another way of saying this is that he can make an action right just by commanding that we do it, and that he can make an action wrong just by commanding that we not do it. So if at the beginning of time God creates a list like this one of the actions humans might engage in, nothing on the list is right or wrong prior to God's commands. Now we would naturally assume that we ought to classify the actions on this list as follows. Lying would be wrong, adultery would be wrong, chewing gum would be right, or at least it would be morally acceptable, helping others would be right, murder would be wrong, and being faithful would be right. And God may, if he had chosen, have done precisely this. But if so, the only thing that makes lying, for example, wrong is that God says that it is wrong. And given that he gets to decide, God could have decided differently. So God could have, if he had chosen, decided to make lying right, adultery right, chewing gum and helping others wrong, murder right, and being faithful wrong. And once again, if he had done this, what would have made faithfulness wrong is just that God had said that it was wrong. But of course, this isn't the only other option God might have taken. He could have done the following. He could have made lying right, adultery wrong, chewing gum wrong, helping others right, murder wrong, and being faithful right. That is, he could have come up with a completely different system for classifying these things. And once again, in this case, lying and being faithful would be right just because God says that they are right. If option B is correct, then God gets to decide which actions are right and which are wrong, and that implies that morality is arbitrary. To say that something is arbitrary is to say that it is not based upon reasons. So in other words, God has no reason to command that we not kill rather than that we do kill, because killing is neither right nor wrong prior to his commands. And this leads us back to the question that I asked earlier. Can God make an action such as killing your neighbor morally right just by saying that it is, or by commanding that we do it? If morality is arbitrary, if that is, it is up to God to decide what is and what is not morally required, then he can do so. Indeed, God can make any gruesome act, such as torturing children, right, just by commanding that we do it. This seems very odd. It certainly conflicts with a very powerful intuition, namely, that something so awful such as torturing a child or killing someone unjustly could never be right. With that in mind, we can now see that both of these options yield very unappealing consequences for Euthyphro, or more relevantly for us, for someone who, like Euthyphro, believes that God is the source of morality. Option A, which claims that God says that right actions are right because they are right, or to put it in terms of commands, that God commands right actions because they are right, implies that God doesn't determine what is right or wrong, that morality is independent of God. Option B, which says that right actions are right just because God commands them, implies that morality is arbitrary. So no matter which option Euthyphro takes, he is going to be impaled by one horn or the other. So that is the end of part 1. In the follow-up, we will take a closer look at the implications that the dilemma has for traditional theism.